There are moments in Hollywood that feel scripted, carefully managed, and polished for public consumption. And then there are moments that feel raw, unplanned, and genuinely human. What Christina Applegate has recently been sharing about her relationship with Ed O'Neill falls firmly into that second category. These are not the kinds of revelations that come from a publicist's press kit or a carefully orchestrated interview designed to promote a new project. These are the kinds of truths that only emerge when someone has lived through enough to stop caring about what the industry thinks of them and starts caring only about what is actually real. Christina Applegate spent 11 years of her life playing Kelly Bundy on Married with Children. 11 years, from the age of 15 to 26. Those are not just any years in a person's life. Those are the years when you figure out who you are. Those are the years when you form your values, your habits, your sense of self. And Christina spent those years on a television set, in front of cameras, playing one of the most provocative characters in the history of American sitcoms. What most people assumed was that the experience was simply a job. A very successful job, certainly. A culturally significant job, without question. But just a job. What Christina has been gradually revealing changes that assumption entirely. Because what happened between her and Ed O'Neill over the course of those 11 years, and in the nearly 3 decades since, was never just professional. It was something far more complicated, far more meaningful, and far more enduring than anything that could be captured in a contract or described in a press release. To understand what Christina has exposed about Ed O'Neill, you first have to understand the environment she was walking into when she joined the cast of Married with Children in 1987. She was a teenager. Not a young adult pretending to be a teenager. An actual 15-year-old girl stepping onto one of the most controversial television productions in the country. The show was deliberately provocative. It was designed to push limits. It was created to make audiences uncomfortable in ways that felt liberating after decades of sanitized family programming. And right in the center of all that creative chaos was a young girl who had not yet developed the emotional armor that most adults carry as a matter of survival in the entertainment industry. Ed O'Neill was not a young man when Married with Children began. He had already lived a significant portion of his life. He had worked in theater. He had done his time paying dues in an industry that is not known for its kindness to people still finding their footing. He understood the pressures, the compromises, the situations that could go sideways in ways that left permanent marks on people who were not equipped to handle them. When he looked across that set and saw Christina Applegate, he apparently saw something that activated every protective instinct he possessed. Not because he was required to protect her. Not because anyone told him to. But because he recognized something vulnerable and genuinely talented, and he made a personal decision to ensure that vulnerability would not be exploited. What Christina has been sharing in recent years paints a portrait of a man who took his unofficial responsibilities as seriously as he took his professional ones. Ed O'Neill, the actor, showed up to play Al Bundy every day with commitment and craft. But Ed O'Neill, the human being, showed up every day to make sure that the teenager working alongside him was not being swallowed alive by an industry that has consumed far too many young people. He was the person who stepped into conversations that were veering in directions that were not appropriate for someone Christina's age. He was the person who made it clear, through action and through presence rather than through declarations, that certain lines simply would not be crossed on his watch. He created, through sheer force of character and reputation, a bubble of safety around a girl who needed one desperately, even if she did not fully understand at the time just how much she needed it. Christina has described moments that most audiences never had any visibility into. The conversations between takes that were not about the next scene or the upcoming episode. The quiet check-ins that Ed made part of his daily routine without ever making them feel clinical or obligatory. The way he would position himself in situations where his presence served as a kind of silent protection. These were not dramatic gestures. They were not the kind of heroics that get celebrated in speeches or written about in entertainment journalism. They were small, consistent daily acts of genuine care that accumulated over 11 years into something that fundamentally shaped who Christina Applegate became as a person and as a professional. What makes Christina's recent revelations particularly striking is the specificity with which she describes the impact Ed had on her development as an actress. This was not simply about keeping her safe. This was also about teaching her. Ed O'Neill came from a theatrical background that had given him a set of skills that pure television performers sometimes lack. He understood how to be present in a scene. He understood how to listen rather than simply wait for his cue to speak. He understood how spontaneity and preparation could coexist in performance in ways that created something more alive than either quality could produce alone. And apparently, he taught those lessons to Christina not through formal instruction, but through the experience of working alongside her every single day. He would make subtle adjustments in his own performance that required her to respond in the moment. He would create situations during scenes where her instincts rather than her preparation had to carry the weight. He was engineering her growth as a performer, quietly and deliberately, over the course of a decade. The relationship between a mentor and a student is one of the most powerful dynamics that exists in any creative field. But it is also one of the most easily corrupted. In Hollywood, the mentor relationship has all too often become a cover story for exploitation. The entertainment industry has a deeply troubling history of people in positions of power using their authority and influence over young performers in ways that caused real and lasting harm. Christina Applegate's story about Ed O'Neill is significant precisely because it represents the opposite of that pattern. It represents what the mentor relationship is supposed to look like. It represents what it looks like when someone with power chooses to use that power to protect and develop rather than to control and exploit. Christina has been clear in distinguishing what she experienced from the darker narratives that have defined so many other young performers' stories about powerful men in Hollywood. Ed O'Neill gave her tools. He gave her protection. He gave her an example of what professional integrity actually looks like in practice. And he never asked for anything in return. The bond between them survived the end of the show, which is itself a remarkable fact. When Married with Children concluded its run in 1997, it did so without the kind of ceremonial closure that long-running productions often provide. There was no grand farewell. There was no emotional final episode designed to give the cast and the audience a meaningful goodbye. The show simply ended, and the family that had formed around that production was suddenly scattered. For Christina, who had spent essentially her entire adolescence and young adulthood in that environment, the ending represented a kind of loss that she has described as genuinely difficult to process. You build your entire existence around a routine, around a community, around a purpose, and then one day it is simply gone. The set gets torn down. The people go their separate ways. And you are left trying to figure out who you are outside of the context that defined you for over a decade. What Christina has revealed is that her connection to Ed O'Neill never experienced that kind of sudden severance. Their relationship did not end when the cameras stopped rolling for the final time. It continued in different forms through different phases of both their lives, as something genuine and self-sustaining rather than something dependent on a professional context to keep it alive. Ed continued to be present in Christina's life as she navigated the post-married with children phase of her career. He watched her take on roles in film and television that demonstrated a range and depth that the Kelly Bundy character had never required her to show. He was, by Christina's account, genuinely proud. Not the performative pride of someone trying to claim credit for another person's success, but the quiet, sustained pride of someone who had believed in a person's potential long before that potential had been proven. Christina's career after Married with Children was genuinely impressive. She demonstrated comedic chops that went beyond what even her most devoted fans had anticipated. She showed dramatic range that surprised people who had only ever seen her play a deliberately shallow character. She became an award-winning performer in her own right, building a body of work that stood entirely on its own merits rather than trading on the nostalgia attached to her most famous role. And through all of it, the relationship with Ed O'Neill remained. Not as a professional relationship, not as a mentorship in any formal sense, but as something that had become simply a part of who both of them were. Then came August 2021, and everything changed. Christina Applegate announced publicly that she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The diagnosis had come while she was still working, still performing, still doing the thing she had dedicated her life to. The disease had been progressing without her full awareness, and when she finally understood what was happening in her own body, the revelation was devastating in ways that she has described with remarkable openness and courage. Multiple sclerosis is not a condition that can be managed into invisibility. It is a chronic, progressive disease that affects the central nervous system, altering mobility, cognitive function, vision, and a range of other capacities that most people never think about until they begin to lose them. For someone whose entire professional identity was built around physical presence and performance, the diagnosis represented a confrontation with loss that was both immediate and ongoing. Christina has spoken about what it means to grieve while still living, to mourn a version of yourself that no longer exists while the person you are now still has to wake up every morning and navigate the world. She has been honest about the anger. She has been honest about the fear. She has been honest about the moments when the weight of what she was facing felt genuinely unsurvivable. And in the context of all of that honesty, she has spoken about Ed O'Neill's response to her diagnosis with an emotion that makes clear just how much it meant to her. Ed did not respond the way acquaintances respond. He did not send a brief message of sympathy and retreat into the comfortable distance that most people maintain when confronted with another person's serious illness. He showed up. He reached out in ways that went beyond what former professional colleagues typically do for each other. He made sure that Christina understood, in concrete and unmistakable terms, that his presence in her life had not been contingent on her health, her career trajectory, or her ability to continue performing at the level she always had. He was there because she was Christina, and that was sufficient reason. The rest of the Married with Children cast also rallied around her in ways that validated everything that Christina had been saying about the family they had formed on that set. Katie Sagal, who had played Peggy Bundy for all 11 seasons, had remained close to Christina throughout the years following the show's end, and was a consistent and vocal source of support following the diagnosis. David Faustino, who had grown up alongside Christina during the show's run in the way that people who share formative experiences always carry a particular kind of bond, made his care and solidarity known. The cast members who had once gathered every week to make television together gather now around one of their own who needed them, proving that the connection they had always described in interviews was not the kind of thing performers say for publicity purposes, but an actual living fact. What Christina has exposed about Ed O'Neill in her recent conversations goes beyond simply describing the warmth of his response to her diagnosis. She has been pulling back the curtain on something more fundamental about who he is as a person and why his influence on her during those 11 years of Married with Children was so deeply formative. She has described a man whose public persona, shaped largely by decades of playing lovably flawed characters on television, does not fully capture the thoughtfulness and intentionality with which he actually moves through the world. The Ed O'Neill that Christina knows is someone who pays attention, someone who notices